Have you ever tried to prove yourself in an argument and then felt the tension linger afterward? You started explaining your point. You carefully presented your reasoning. Maybe you even corrected someone publicly, feeling sure you were right. And in that moment, it felt powerful. It felt like control, like you were finally asserting yourself and standing your ground. But a few minutes later, the energy shifted. The room felt colder. Respect quietly slipped away. The conversation that once felt important slowly became exhausting. There is a subtle truth about human nature that people have noticed for centuries. The moment we try to dominate a discussion, we often surrender control instead. Proving we are right can trick the mind into thinking we are winning, when in fact we are fueling tension and resistance. Arguments rarely teach or persuade. They often divide and drain. Real influence doesn't happen in the heat of conflict. It happens quietly, in patience, in observation, in the moments when your mind stays calm, even while others are losing theirs. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And the moment you begin to understand that principle, the way you engage with conflict and with life itself begins to change. Most people believe arguments are about discovering the truth. On the surface, it makes sense. Two people disagree, they exchange ideas, and eventually the stronger reasoning should win. But real conversations rarely follow that pattern. Most arguments are about ego. Someone feels dismissed. Someone senses their status is challenged. Their identity or competence feels threatened. And in that moment, the discussion shifts from understanding to defending. Small cues reveal it. A tightening jaw, a pause before speaking, a subtle change in tone. Pride takes control. Logic retreats. People stop listening for clarity and start listening for weaknesses. The harder someone tries to prove they are right, the less anyone else actually hears them. What remains is tension, subtle resentment, and distance that can quietly grow over time. Think back to your last heated exchange. Maybe it happened at work, at home, or online. At first, the issue seemed small, a difference of opinion, a misunderstanding, or a minor criticism. Then something changed. Voices grew sharper, words became precise, almost like weapons. Instead of asking questions, statements were delivered to corner the other person. Each response carried more emotion. Soon, the conversation was no longer about solving anything. It became about standing ground. Someone needed to be right. Someone needed to avoid looking wrong. By that point, the original issue was rarely resolved. All that remained was friction and an unspoken feeling that something important had been lost. This dynamic has existed for centuries. Observers of human behavior noted how quickly pride enters a discussion, seizing control before reason can intervene. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You always own the option of having no opinion." Most arguments continue because someone feels compelled to defend a position. Stepping back feels unnatural, yet it is profoundly liberating. Releasing the need to prove yourself allows space to observe what is happening. Observation, more than rapid response, restores control. Instead of reacting, you watch. You notice tone, posture, and the subtle emotional currents that guide every word. Arguments escalate because emotion moves faster than reason. The brain treats disagreement as a threat to status or competence. Reaction is almost instantaneous. Logic lags behind. Words are spoken from impulse, not clarity. Seneca once said, "No man was ever wise by chance. Wisdom requires awareness. It demands the discipline to notice what is happening inside your mind before your words leave your mouth. Without it, conversations become automatic reactions. The louder the emotion rises, the weaker reasoning becomes. People stop considering solutions. They focus on winning. Once you notice these patterns, a subtle shift occurs. Instead of reacting to provocation, you begin observing the dynamics at play. You see triggers, pride, and hidden motives behind every statement. You learn to respond deliberately rather than impulsively. Calm observation allows you to create space where insight can emerge. Tense conversations become mirrors, revealing not just the other person's patterns, but your own. Awareness allows engagement without losing control. You can influence without force. Over time, this practice transforms interactions. Validation before argument, observation before reaction, and awareness before engagement slowly reshape the conversation. The person across from you notices your steadiness. Their attempts to provoke are less effective because the usual responses that feed tension no longer appear. You are no longer caught in the emotional cycle of every disagreement. Instead, you guide the discussion quietly, preserving your energy and clarity. People naturally begin to approach you differently. They bring problems rather than arguments, questions rather than challenges. Your influence grows without confrontation because steadiness itself exerts authority. This approach requires no manipulation or deception. It is rooted in presence, patience, and self-awareness. You do not ignore the other person. You simply recognize the futility of certain conflicts and choose where to invest your energy. Aristotle once said, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet." The bitter patience of observing without reacting eventually produces calm, credibility, and influence. Your presence alone becomes stabilizing. Conversations become constructive rather than combative. Relationships improve not through force, but through consistent restraint and measured engagement. Ultimately, the mastery of conversation lies in choosing peace over victory. Calm steadiness shapes interactions in subtle but profound ways. You are not defensive. You are not reactive. You are steady. Your words carry weight because they are deliberate, not reactionary. Over time, people learn that arguing with you is unproductive. Influence comes quietly, but consistently. The moments you resist the urge to fight become the moments where your control over the conversation and over your own mind deepens. And once this discipline takes root, you notice that life itself begins to move more smoothly, because you are no longer drawn into every unnecessary conflict. If this perspective resonates with you, consider subscribing as a quiet commitment to cultivating calm, clarity, and wisdom in your own life. Each time you engage with this content, you take a deliberate step toward mastering your mind rather than reacting to the world. The deeper issue is that arguments often feel satisfying in the moment. There is a certain rush that comes from delivering the perfect comeback or exposing the weakness in someone else's logic. For a brief moment, it can feel like triumph, but that feeling fades quickly. What remains afterward is usually distance. The other person walks away remembering the tension rather than the insight. The irritation that fuels arguments is rarely about the other person alone. It often reveals our own sensitivities, our own insecurities, and the places where our identity feels fragile. When someone challenges those areas, the reaction can feel automatic. But recognizing that reaction is the beginning of freedom. Instead of immediately responding with force, you begin to notice the pattern itself. Once you start seeing arguments through this lens, a different understanding begins to form. Disagreements are not tests of intelligence, they are tests of emotional control. The person who remains calm in the middle of tension usually holds the real advantage. Not because they have stronger opinions, but because they are not being carried away by the emotional current of the moment. Epictetus once said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When someone disagrees with you, the disturbance rarely comes from their words alone. It comes from the meaning your mind assigns to those words. Perhaps it feels like disrespect. Perhaps it feels like rejection. But when you begin separating the event from the judgment, the emotional grip loosens. You can hear criticism without immediately turning it into a threat, and that single shift changes the direction of the conversation. The surprising result is that calmness often carries more influence than forceful arguments ever could. When someone refuses to be pulled into emotional conflict, the entire rhythm of the discussion changes. The tension has nowhere to attach itself. Instead of reacting quickly, the calm person listens, observes, and responds with measured clarity. Over time, people begin to notice that difference. They sense stability in someone who does not rush to defend themselves. They sense strength in someone who does not need to raise their voice to be heard. Slowly, without any dramatic display, the balance of the conversation shifts. Others begin speaking more carefully. The atmosphere softens, and what started as potential conflict becomes something closer to understanding. From that point forward, the question naturally becomes less about proving yourself right, and more about recognizing the deeper reasons we feel so compelled to argue in the first place. The real answer is pride. Most arguments do not begin with complicated ideas or deep disagreements. They begin with something much smaller. Someone questions your opinion. Someone criticizes a decision you made. Someone says something that makes you feel misunderstood, dismissed, or slightly disrespected. It can happen in seconds. One sentence is enough, and almost immediately your mind begins preparing a response. You search for the perfect explanation. Your thoughts start arranging facts and examples. Your heart rate rises just a little. The body tightens in ways you barely notice. In that brief moment, the mind believes it is protecting itself. But something important has already happened beneath the surface. You have accepted the invitation to fight, not with fists, but with words. And once that invitation is accepted, the conversation begins moving in a direction that is very difficult to reverse. This reaction feels natural because the human mind is designed to protect identity. When someone questions your view, the brain often interprets it as a challenge to competence or intelligence. Even a small disagreement can feel like a subtle attack on who you are. That is why responses appear so quickly. The mind rushes forward to defend its position before reason has fully examined the situation. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That observation reveals something quiet but powerful. The words spoken by the other person are rarely the real problem. What truly drives the reaction is the meaning your mind attaches to those words. When you interpret disagreement as disrespect, your emotions rise instantly. But when you see it as information, the situation changes. The same words carry far less weight. This is where discipline begins to matter. Most people react before they even realize they are reacting. The response jumps out automatically, shaped by habit and emotion. Yet there is a small moment between hearing something and responding to it. That moment is almost invisible, but it exists. In that small space lies a surprising amount of freedom. Epictetus once said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." Your reaction belongs to that small circle of things within your power. When you learn to pause inside that moment instead of rushing past it, the entire direction of a conversation begins to shift. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe the situation as it unfolds. You notice the tone of the other person's voice. You notice your own rising emotions. And for the first time, you begin choosing your response instead of being carried away by it. The disciplined mind does something very different from the reactive mind. Instead of defending itself immediately, it becomes curious. Curiosity is surprisingly powerful in moments of tension. When someone challenges your view, curiosity breaks the expected pattern. Instead of pushing back, you slow the conversation down. You ask a simple question, something like, "Help me understand what you mean," or "Why do you see it that way?" Sometimes you ask what concerns them most about the situation. These questions do not weaken your position. They change the structure of the exchange. Suddenly, the other person is explaining rather than attacking. Their attention shifts away from confrontation and toward clarification. The conversation begins to move in a new direction where understanding becomes possible again. When curiosity replaces defense, the emotional temperature in the room often drops almost immediately. People rarely expect calm questions when they are prepared for resistance. The tension loses momentum because there is nothing to push against. Instead of building a wall between two opposing positions, the conversation opens a small path where both sides can look at the issue together. Seneca once said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Delay does not mean silence forever. It means giving reason the time it needs to catch up with emotion. When you pause long enough to ask a thoughtful question instead of delivering a quick defense, you create space for clarity to enter the discussion. But curiosity alone does not dissolve every conflict. Words are only part of what moves people during disagreements. Beneath every statement lies a feeling that is often far stronger than the argument itself. Someone may speak sharply not because the issue is important, but because they feel unheard. Someone may challenge your idea not because it is flawed, but because they feel their own voice has been overlooked. When irritation appears in conversation, it often reveals emotional currents that logic alone cannot resolve. Recognizing those emotions changes how you respond. Instead of trying to overpower someone with reasoning, you begin noticing what the conversation is really about. Once you begin seeing these emotional undercurrents, your approach becomes more patient. You start listening not only to the words being spoken, but also to the feelings behind them. A person who feels respected becomes far more open to hearing another perspective. A person who feels ignored will often argue harder, regardless of how strong the reasoning against them may be. That is why calm attention can be more effective than forceful persuasion. The goal is no longer to win quickly, but to understand what is actually driving the disagreement. When people sense that they are being heard, their need to defend themselves slowly fades. This shift in perspective transforms the entire nature of disagreement. Instead of rushing to prove yourself correct, you begin observing the conversation as it unfolds. The focus moves from defending your position to understanding the situation. That small change may seem subtle at first, but its effect is profound. The argument loses its urgency. The pressure to respond immediately disappears. In its place appears something quieter and far more productive, a space where listening matters as much as speaking. And once that space begins to open, the conversation naturally moves toward a deeper realization about how emotions shape every conflict that follows. People rarely argue because they are searching for facts or clarity. The assumption that an argument is a search for truth is almost always misleading. Most arguments are driven by something far more basic, the need for validation. Someone feels dismissed, someone feels unheard, someone senses that their perspective, their effort, or even their presence is being overlooked. And the moment those feelings arise, logic quietly retreats. You can lay out facts, present evidence, or construct the most precise argument imaginable, but if the other person feels attacked, their mind shuts down before you even finish speaking. This is why careful attention to emotion is often more important than the content of the argument itself. It is the invisible current that controls the flow of nearly every disagreement, yet it is overlooked by most people who rush to speak before understanding. Imagine a situation where someone you care about or work with says, "You never listen to me." The instinct is almost immediate. You feel a surge to defend yourself, to prove that the accusation is false. "That's not true," you might respond. In that split second, the emotional fire stokes higher. The defense, however justified it may be, does nothing to reduce tension. It only strengthens the perception of opposition. The cleverer approach is different. You respond with calm honesty, acknowledging the feeling without surrendering your own perspective. "I can see why it might feel that way," or "I understand that this is frustrating for you." That small shift, a few words carefully chosen, does something extraordinary. It interrupts the reactive rhythm. It removes the need for the other person to escalate, and it signals that their feelings are being recognized. Once a person feels heard, their mind softens, their posture relaxes, and the space for reason to enter expands naturally. There is a quiet power in acknowledging emotions before introducing logic. Logic without empathy often feels like a weapon. Empathy without understanding is empty. Epictetus once said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." In the context of disagreements, this is precisely what happens. People are disturbed not by your words, but by the meaning they assign to them. Recognizing that allows you to step into a different mode entirely. You are no longer engaged in a duel of statements. You are observing, listening, and subtly guiding the conversation toward insight. Validation is not capitulation. It is removing the emotional barrier that blocks constructive exchange. By acknowledging what is felt before what is argued, you create a foundation where clarity can arise without provoking defensiveness. Even when emotions are addressed, there is another layer to consider. Sometimes an argument persists, not because someone believes they are objectively right, but because admitting they were wrong threatens their identity. Pride can anchor a position more strongly than any evidence. Once a person has publicly taken a stance, retracting it feels like a loss of self. Socrates once said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for content is the wealth of nature." In this context, contentment is not about accepting the other's perspective. It is about reducing the need to demonstrate superiority in every exchange. By recognizing the role of pride, you can understand why arguments can continue long after the factual dispute has been resolved. It is a battle over image rather than insight, a struggle to preserve dignity rather than a search for truth. The beauty of addressing emotion first is that it simultaneously opens the door for discussion and removes unnecessary conflict. Instead of proving yourself correct, you create a space where the other person no longer feels the need to fight. This approach transforms the conversation into a joint exploration rather than a contest of wills. Observing the way pride and validation influence interactions can illuminate patterns in your own responses. You begin noticing the triggers that provoke defensiveness, the moments when a reaction is automatic, and the small opportunities to intervene deliberately. Self-awareness becomes the foundation of influence, allowing you to act rather than react, to guide rather than dominate, and to preserve peace without sacrificing clarity. Once someone feels understood, their resistance diminishes naturally. You do not need to overwhelm with counter-arguments or flood the room with evidence. Calm listening creates a psychological shift. The other person feels respected, their mind relaxes, and the argument often softens on its own. It is a subtle, almost imperceptible redirection of energy, but it is profoundly effective. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." In conversations, wasting energy in defensive arguments is one of the easiest ways to deplete mental and emotional resources. When you focus on listening first, responding second, and understanding throughout, the time spent is productive, the interaction constructive, and the relationship preserved. There is also an important strategic element. Arguments rarely resolve if one person is trying to avoid looking wrong. When someone's self-image is at stake, they cling to their position even when they internally recognize its flaws. Understanding the psychological stakes of an argument is a form of wisdom. When you perceive that the real battle is not over facts, but over self-perception, you can choose how and when to respond. You are no longer participating blindly in a fight. You are observing the terrain, identifying motives, and selecting your actions with deliberate care. The conversation ceases to be a test of who is cleverer and becomes an opportunity to maintain stability, clarity, and composure. The transformation occurs when you shift from defending to understanding, from reacting to observing, and from proving to guiding. Once emotions are acknowledged and pride is respected, arguments lose their urgency. People begin to listen instead of attack. Words cease to be weapons and become tools for clarity. The conversation moves forward without unnecessary tension, and both parties find a place where insight can emerge. In this space, disagreement no longer feels threatening. Instead, it becomes manageable, productive, and even illuminating. The subtle power of validation before logic, observation before reaction, and awareness before defense reshapes every interaction, and it is here, in this quiet discipline, that real control and influence begin. Human beings guard their dignity with an intensity that often surprises even those closest to them. It is woven into the very fabric of how we navigate the world. If someone feels cornered or forced to admit a mistake, the instinctive reaction is rarely a calm acknowledgement. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the mind is wired to protect identity. The threat of public embarrassment or perceived weakness triggers an almost automatic defense. You can see it in small ways: a tightened jaw, a quick rebuttal, a refusal to look at the other person. It is subtle, yet powerful, and it completely shifts the dynamics of any conversation. One simple phrase like "you're wrong" carries far more weight than the words themselves. Even delivered politely, it can make someone's focus pivot entirely from the subject at hand to defending their own sense of self. The priority ceases to be clarity, solution, or truth, and becomes instead self-preservation. But there is a path that avoids this trap without sacrificing your own perspective. Instead of confronting directly, you can gently invite reflection by showing that you once held a similar view. A simple, "I used to see it that way too until I noticed something interesting," opens a door. It reframes the conversation. Suddenly, you are not above them, you are beside them. Both of you were once in the same place of understanding. The difference is not presented as superiority, but as shared discovery. That subtle shift diffuses defensive energy and allows for reconsideration without threatening pride. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." The reaction to challenge, not the challenge itself, determines the tone of the conversation. By framing disagreement as exploration rather than correction, you preserve dignity on both sides while still steering toward insight. Still, patience and empathy are not guarantees that every disagreement will resolve itself. Some people cling to their stance for reasons deeper than logic or emotion. Their identity is intertwined with their position. Trying to force them to change or confront them aggressively almost always backfires. It risks escalating tension, triggering deeper defensiveness, or permanently closing channels of communication. In these moments, knowing when to redirect the discussion becomes crucial. Rather than continuing a dialogue that reinforces resistance, the skilled communicator shifts focus. This can mean addressing a different aspect of the topic, inviting them to consider a broader perspective, or even pausing entirely to allow reflection. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." The principle extends to conversations. It is often wiser to preserve the relationship and the possibility of influence than to force immediate agreement. One practical method of preserving dignity is subtle alignment with shared values. Instead of negating an idea, you can connect with elements of it that are valid or admirable. For instance, if someone proposes a plan you disagree with, acknowledge the intent behind it, the care, effort, or reasoning that motivated it. By validating the person's purpose, you reduce the instinct to defend while still creating an opening to introduce alternative perspectives. Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Most of the tension in arguments is created in anticipation or projection of judgment rather than in the actual content. By addressing emotion before logic, you dissolve imagined threats and lower resistance, making real understanding possible. Ultimately, the mastery of conversation lies not in proving others wrong, but in cultivating an environment where ideas can be exchanged without ego interference. The skill is subtle, requiring observation, reflection, and a willingness to prioritize dignity